Thank you, Dr. Vinod Gupta, members of this distinguished audience in this world-famous university. I'm going to speak to you about a subject which probably will be of dominant importance in the coming 10 years as to what's going to happen between the present competition, unstated competition between India and China. In some ways, we are similar. Large countries. We have billion-plus population, which no other country in the world has. I think the closest that comes is the United States, which probably is 300 million plus. But India is about 1.2 billion, and China has 1.3 billion. And I'm told in 2021, we'll overtake China and become the largest population country in the world. Land mass is also very large. We are both neighbors. Till 1962, although we had relations from 700 BC, we never had a single quarrel, leave alone a war. And people from both countries traversed to each other's countries, played a role, some of them significant, like Dharma, who went from Tamil Nadu, deep south, to Shaolin and set up a monastery there and taught people what later came to be known as karate or wushu in China. Of course, Buddhism traveled from India to China, and Chinese travelers brought in many things which we didn't know before, such as silk. Trade was flourishing between the two countries. Together, till about 1700, the two countries were considered the most developed countries by then contemporary standards, and accounted for more than 50% of the world GDP. That was the situation in 1700. And then, of course, they were subjected to foreign invasions. They were subjected to imperialism. And as a consequence, by 1950, when both became liberated in different ways, India became independent of Britain, and China overthrew an existing government and established the People's Republic of China. So in 1950, both were quite poor. They together only constituted about 6% of the world's GDP, and they began the process of reconstruction. Now, of course, the records are much better available. We have this great problem in comparing India and China because India is an open society. India is a relatively free press. And the minuses of India do get reflected in the media, unlike in China, which is a closed society, and therefore we really have to work through the data in a big way in order to be able to get to the truth, because based on anecdotal evidence, travel around. No, that's fine. I don't need it. Based on, excuse me, based on anecdotal evidence, newspaper accounts, and so on, it's not possible to be able to really get at the truth. And we have to really look at the data and rework it, because there is a difference between the statistical system of China and the statistical system of India. India, of course, has a much longer tradition in collecting data. India has a better enumeration system. China, in fact, the first population census ever conducted in China was in 1981, whereas India in the 19th century and even before was conducting national population census. So even in the question of working on data, we have to do a lot of preliminary work. And my earliest work in the 60s and 70s under Professor Simon Kuznets' able guidance was to rework the entire information and come to a more objective assessment of how China was doing and how India was doing. By popular impression, even today, China gets a much better press than India for this reason. But the closer examination of the data show the situation is somewhat different. For example, in the early days, China used to define the production of food grains, for example, to include the paddy, that is the before the chaff was taken out. That is, it was not, the weight didn't reflect only the rice, but also reflected the chaff which came with it. And that made a 25% difference, because not only that, but they also included potatoes in food grains, which no other country included. For some time, they even included production of pigs in the capital formation of China. And they had very poor price indexes, so we had very hard to get constant price estimates to get an objective analysis of what the growth rate was. And so over the years, of course, China's statistical system has considerably improved. And today, when we look back, I can say between the period 1950 and 1980, the growth rate of both China and India, and both following the Soviet economic model, which essentially meant extract resources from agriculture and finance and industrial program. The growth rate of both countries was about the same at 3.5 to 3.8% per year. This was when I first came out with this conclusion, there was a lot of controversy, there was a lot of criticism, and I was, of course, denounced as an Indian nationalist who wanted to portray India in a better light than it was. But fortunately, after Deng Xiaoping took over and he decided to revamp statistics, he had to join the UN. China joined the UN, China joined the World Bank, so they had to conform to certain standards. And the Chinese themselves confirmed that in 1980, the growth rate of the previous 40 years was 3.5%, and the per capita income was about $250, which is about the same as India. But in 1980, the Chinese made a bold decision to throw off the Soviet system and go in for economic reforms. They began with agriculture, and then into industry, and then into the pricing system. And as a consequence, the growth rates vastly increased. India still hung on to the Soviet system, and therefore continued at that lower rate. And it's only in 1990, after the Soviet Union unraveled into 16 countries, and the Soviet influence in India became zero, that we were in a position to really take the necessary steps for economic reform. It's around that time I became a cabinet minister, a senior cabinet minister, and the blueprints were prepared by me. Our government fell after some time, and a new government headed by Narasimha Rao came in, and Mr. Narasimha Rao invited me to join the government, which required my joining his party, which I was not willing to do. And therefore, he had to create a cabinet-level position so I could attend cabinet meetings, and the process of economic reforms became well known to the world. The finance minister was Mr. Manmohan Singh, who is widely known abroad. So there was a team which worked and put together an economic package of deregulation, mostly deregulation. And that was enough for India also to accelerate its growth rate. And by the mid-90s, we were very close to the growth rates of China and have continued to be around the Chinese figure since then. It's only now the Chinese growth rate seems to be decelerating for a variety of internal reasons, which I'll talk to you about. And India has also reduced its growth rate from the first decade of the 21st century. But still, it was not much of a reduction. And therefore, today we are more or less running at the same rate of about 7.5% per year. That's the current situation. Now, the question therefore becomes, how do we assess what's going to happen in the future? And that naturally all projections are dicey, but here there are some objective factors we have to consider. First of all, we have to see how China has grown and how India has grown, and whether India could continue that or China could continue the same model in the future. China has 3 or 4 elements, vital elements in its growth. First is that it made a heroic effort in mobilizing domestic savings. It made also great efforts to get foreign direct investment. And as a consequence, it was running between 40 and 45% of the GDP as far as the investment was concerned, which is almost, I think it is probably the world's number 1 position as far as rate of investment is concerned. India did not get much foreign investment. And India relied on household savings, which is something unique for India. And about 85% of the total savings in the country is done by the households. And as a consequence, India also has a very high rate of investment. So both countries believed in making great efforts in mobilizing large amount of funds from within the country to use it in development. But China had some unique other arrangements which were novel in some ways, recognizing that East Asia was now becoming the labor costs in East Asia were rising. And East Asia had, in fact, achieved its growth essentially by exporting what the United States perhaps invented or the United States was known for manufacturing. They were able to do it cheaper and better and a much higher quality. And so therefore, soon enough, they became the main supplier of these modern manufactured goods. For example, Motorola used to produce radios in America. It was very well known for producing radios, but then soon the Japanese came into the picture, Panasonic and Sony and so many others. And as a consequence, Motorola just gave up producing radios, and all that was necessary was being imported from Japan. So over the years, Japanese and East Asian countries' labor became a bit expensive and became harder and harder for them to export to the West. So at that time, China stepped in and said, we will buy semi-processed goods from East Asia and add value to it and then export it to the West. So there began a novel experiment where China was able to it was running a deficit trade with East Asia, but at the same time, it was adding value, and that value was being added by foreign-aided industries. That is, the foreign companies came in, they set up with the help of the Chinese joint ventures, and they then added. For instance, Lenovo is in its basic structure is not produced in China, it's produced in Taiwan. But China adds the peripherals, And as a consequence, it becomes a Chinese product. And then it gets exported to the West. And in the process, China was able to have a deficit of trade with East Asia, but an enormous surplus of trade with Europe and America. And that's how it built up its huge foreign exchange reserves. So this was one thing that China did in a very systematic way, and that is probably the main reason for the growth of China in this impressive growth that we have seen in the last 30 years. So whether the key factor would be for the future, whether this is a matter, this is a model or a mechanism which can continue in the future. Now, as far as India is concerned, India never placed much emphasis on foreign trade, and therefore all of its growth that is achieved has essentially come through internal production, and more importantly in the services that it provided in terms of the normal services of restaurants and financial services and the like, which led to a situation which is unprecedented in the world, where for a developing country to have the share of services as over 50% of the GDP. So the manufacturing sector was a relatively weaker sector compared to China. And the services sector was much stronger than the Chinese services sector. And there was a huge earning that China was able to put together in reserves by this switch trade of East Asians exporting semi-processed goods, and that coming to the United States and Europe. So today the issue is that can this continue? The other aspect of Chinese growth, which is worrisome, and now if you read Wall Street or Journal or the New York Times and all, you're getting reports of it in an anecdotal form. But the fact is that China had put in so much money by printing notes into infrastructure. So a massive infrastructure has been built in China. But its utilization is quite poor because the purchasing power parity, the purchasing power of the people has not been commensurate. So today we have a bubble that is developed in its property and its infrastructure. And there are now serious reports of this property bubble bursting, and which could then lead to a major reversal for China. You must remember that there are certain balances we have to maintain in the economy. You know that Japan grew impressively from 1965 to 1995, and so impressively that the World Bank brought out a report based on the Japanese model adoption in other parts of Southeast Asia and called it the East Asia Miracle. So the World Bank produced a book, not so much to introduce to the West what Japan and East Asia was doing, but to tell other developing countries that if you do what the Japanese have done and the East Asians have done, you'll also grow at this pace. And that's what they called as getting their basics right. But in 1997, there was a financial crisis in East Asia, and all these countries sank together. And many of them are still to recover. Certainly Japan has not recovered even now after that major collapse. Now this is a phenomenon you can see in other parts of the world too. For many, many years we thought that the next developed country would be Argentina or Chile or Brazil. But unfortunately Latin America kept going into these financial crises from time and again, and therefore that promise has not been fulfilled because of the same reason. Well, not because of the reasons for these crises were the same, but broadly speaking, when a financial system is not a developed financial system, and it is based on in terms of the government doing ad hoc measures and getting the economy regenerated, then it's only a matter of time before you have this crisis. So Latin American crisis and the East Asian crisis, both these are worth studying, and they are examples of how not to grow. Europe and America grew and then remained developed countries. They had, of course, their ups and downs and bumps, but the fact is that ultimately their trajectory was such that they became developed countries and remained developed countries. India's financial system, in comparison to China, is a much superior financial system. The transparency as well as the controls are substantial. And therefore, if India were to grow in the future, it won't be because the financial system would not be a drawback. Whereas China has to address this problem very quickly. They have to deal with this issue. Their banks are now practically bankrupt because they've been giving loans which don't get returned. And the particular problem with China is that the state-owned enterprises, they are not able to disband it. They are not able to sell the bigger ones because these are which employ essentially the Communist Party cadres, and the state enterprises of China, they provide all kinds of facilities for their workers, housing, free health, free schooling, and so on. And so if you were to close that down, there would be a major upheaval politically for China. So at the same time, they don't make any profit. They're perpetually in loss. So there's a bleeding process going on. So today we find that because of these various little trends, we are getting reports that several of the companies which are in the private sector are not able to pay their workers' salaries. There are demonstrations which are not getting reported. So there is a serious problem that China has to face. And of course, it has world consequences because China has been a driving machine for the world. So this is another aspect which we have to examine. There's also another aspect, not a major aspect, but this is an important aspect, could become a major aspect in the future. And a problem in its extreme form you see in Europe. And that is, you see, China took the call for controlling population very seriously. And therefore, they adopted the one child per family norm, and they imposed it very severely and strictly. As a consequence, there's a much higher ratio of people above 65 in China than other developing countries, certainly in comparison with India. And as a consequence, because China was a socialist state and it had social security, and this is a liability which the Chinese are finding increasingly to discharge, and they're using printing of notes as a method of being able to pay, but that cannot go on. This problem of aging populations is also a problem in Europe because fewer and fewer people are entering the labor force, and larger people are retiring and living longer also. And earlier on, when more people entered the labor force and relatively less people retired, the people who entered the labor force, they had pay cuts for their gratuity and provident fund and so on. And that money used to be used to pay for the pension funds or the provident funds of those who retired. So there was a system which balanced itself. But today, Europe has this problem. They don't know what to do with this pension bomb, and I think much of the problems in Greece arose because of that. Now, China, because of its seriousness in dealing with the population problem, has had this new issue that has come up. And the Japanese are also having the same problem. In fact, their entire toy industry is practically disappearing because of the fact that the population has now has slowed down so much, and the population is getting aged. On an average basis, today the average age of an Indian is 26 years. And we have 540 million Indians below the age of 25. There's no match for this in any other country in the world. And the average age of the Chinese is 35 as compared to 26 in India. And the Americans is 37, Europe is 46, and Japanese is 50. And what is the advantage of a younger population? Because India also tried some serious family planning measures. Mrs. Gandhi declared a state of emergency, suspended the fundamental rights under the Constitution. All that was illegal. Later on, we found out, but the fact is at that time she was able to do it. And then she focused on restricting number of children to 2. But the end result was that the people revolted and she lost the election. Primarily, not entirely, but primarily due to the fact that she had done this. There is an economic calculus which Indians, I suppose people anywhere practice, but there was an economic calculus in producing children. It was weighed against the educational opportunities. If there was no hope for any educational opportunity, then people had more children because then they could work with the parents and supplement the family income. So as the prosperity grew in India, the population growth rate is also beginning to decline. And today, it was only about 15 years ago, we were growing at 2.2% per year. But now we are down to 1.7% per year. But our decline is gradual, whereas in the Chinese case, it was very sharp. And it is now, I think the Chinese are openly admitting that 1 child per family was a disaster. Now, why I'm saying that this is an important factor is that ultimately we know now in economics that economic growth and accelerating economic growth has much less to do with putting more capital and more labor into the market or into the system. It is much more due to the new innovations that you bring for combining labor and capital. And that's how we have been seeing in the history. After all, the Industrial Revolution owes itself to the invention of locomotives and railways and the Bessemer steel blast furnace. The Americans came up with this integrated factory system, and later on jet engines, fax machines, and now recently the internet. And this has been a big boost for higher and higher growth rates. So instead of moving along a curve, you move from one curve to another when innovation is introduced into a system. It is here, I think, India has more potential than China. Take, for instance, agriculture. Today, India has as much arable land as China, although China is geographically a bigger country. But the fact is that vast parts of it are not arable. So if you look at the arable area, India and China are the same arable level. About 120 million hectares is the arable land in both countries. Whereas in China, it's highly intensively utilized. There's been a much larger deployment of fertilizer, pesticides, and these other aids for production. And the yields are also pretty high. Whereas India has, number one, although it has a facility of growing crops all through the year, all 12 months of the year, whereas some countries like the United States, obviously because of snowfall, cannot perhaps for 5 months do any agriculture at all. And same in China, good parts of China, agriculture is not possible because of snow. But in India, the weather is such that you can do it for all 12 months, which means you can grow 3 crops. China grows more than 2 crops in about 80% of its arable land, whereas in India, only 25% of our land is utilized for growing more than 1 crop. And so there is this potential that can be used in the future. The Indian agriculture could in fact become the new driving force for India if the problems are addressed of Indian agriculture. For example, the yield per acre in India of agricultural products is very low compared to an international comparison. Take for instance rice, the yield per acre is 1/6 that you get in Japan or even South Africa. And the Indian agricultural products, the prices are also very low. I mean, Indian agriculture is one of the cheapest agricultures. If you were to look at price of rice compared to most of the rice growing countries, you'll find it in 1/7, 1/6, 1/5 in that ratio. So it's a cheap product which is capable of export, provided the backup infrastructure is there. So this is something which India can afford. It can afford to be an agricultural exporting country, which China cannot. The second thing is that Indian skilled labor is still one of the cheapest in the world, and certainly compared to China is much cheaper. So tomorrow, it's just possible, if the conditions are right, that the East Asian semi-processed goods coming to China decided to come via India. And there are some advantages of that. First of all, we have a democratic system which has courts. We have a strict patent law which conforms to the WTO standards. And certainly on copying, duplicating, we have much stricter laws. So there is a possibility that the East Asian countries, being democratic countries themselves, may prefer India to China, and especially if Chinese labor becomes more and more expensive. So if that happens, that will be a major boon for India, and a major setback for China. So, the Indian sea lanes are much more open and easily accessible than for China. Consequently, this is something that we are studying in India, how to seduce the East Asians to abandon China and come to India. But that requires that we need to improve our infrastructure. Most of the Japanese businessmen complain about the rotten financial structure, the rotten infrastructure in our country, roads, and so on, and the hassles which are still there not at the central level, but at the provincial level. These have to be addressed, and if we manage to do that, then I think India would be a big gainer and certainly will be able to establish a lead over China. So this is the third thing is, we have this young population which now the UN no more refers to as a population problem, but as a demographic dividend. They've given a new name for it. And this demographic dividend is a potential dividend. Suppose we were able to educate this young crowd, not all 540 million people maybe for the time being, but a large section of them, motivate them to think in terms of innovations. And those innovations which will make us move from one curve to a higher curve. Take, for example, the question of power. Now, so far we have been using river waters, hydroelectric power, and coal-based power. But we have 60% of the world's thorium, which is a nuclear fuel, which of course requires a great deal of processing to be able to be put in a reactor. And there are in fact 3 stages to be crossed. India's research has now crossed 2 stages, and we can easily make it to the 3rd stage with some effort. On the contrary, the Chinese don't have world over, there is a uranium shortage developing. Maybe by 2050, it will become very difficult to access uranium, certainly for power projects. And therefore, the Chinese would be in a bind on that, whereas as India is concerned, it will be if we solve this problem of thorium, having 60% of the world's supply in our country, I think we would be able to generate power on a clean basis. Thorium fuel is much cleaner than uranium, and that would give India a huge advantage. India also has a large number of rivers. China has some large rivers, but not the number of rivers here. But these rivers require to be put into a water grid. If we could get our young population to think in innovational terms, the education should be such. Now, I think one of the great new developments is this online education which has come, which enables us to reach education to the more rural areas of India, the tier 2 and tier 3 cities. So here is a situation where if the new government that has come to power last year is able to address this issue of education, reform in an education, in terms of empowering the students not to become civil servants and people as paid employees, which unfortunately the old system which the British imposed in India, and naturally for their interests, was only to produce clerks and people who will be employees. But innovators, and for that you have to have a backing in terms of infrastructure and in terms of institutions. So this is something that we are seriously working on. And I think in case of China, for all its classy universities infrastructure, the basic factor is missing, and that is democracy, the freedom to think the unthinkable. In fact, there is some evidence that China is getting a little stricter on the scope of your thinking. Now, I think that democracy is indivisible. You can't say you can have democracy in science, but not in social sciences or in the liberal arts. And there, I think we will find probably Indians much better placed in solving problems. We need also to think about finding alternatives to crude oil, because 86% of crude oil comes from the Arab countries, and it's a big strain on us because the prices keep going up and down, and therefore we need some alternatives, particularly for automobiles and motor vehicles. And now Toyota has decided to introduce end of this year a hydrogen fuel cell car, and that, in my opinion, would be something that we have also done a lot of research on hydrogen fuel cells. And if that is implemented, India would become much more self-reliant. So I think these three factors, one, the ability to make the East Asians participate in Indian development process by diverting the semi-processed goods to China, to India, to the tapping of this demographic dividend that we have. And the Indians have performed in different climates and different environments much brilliantly. So therefore, I don't think there's any doubt that if we gave our people within India the right kind of education, they would not be able to solve problems which were once upon a time thought of to be unsolvable. So this will be the second. And the third thing, of course, is the fact that India is today a democratic society. It has enormous soft power to attract investments from abroad. These three factors give you a distinct edge over China. Do I think that India would overtake China? Well, first of all, as far as growth rates are concerned, I think you will probably start seeing, already there are preliminary, some publications of the World Bank and IMF saying India would overtake China in the next 2 years in its GDP growth. But that doesn't mean the gap can't be closed. The gap is essentially, by the way, between India and China was established only in 10-year period between 1980 and 1990, when India stuck to the Soviet model, where China abandoned it and adopted market reforms. So the gap is not all that great, even if in terms of ratios of production and so on, you can show it. But India is a much better organized country. India has got a much stronger financial system. And China, I think, in my opinion, is going the Japanese way, because it's not in a position to rectify its financial system without a crisis. And therefore, I do foresee that by 2030, India to get ahead of China. This is my submission. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.